My sister Ren's kids had a nickname for me that I wasn't supposed to know about, though kids are never as quiet as they think they are. The family joke, they called me, usually followed by giggling that stopped abruptly whenever I walked into a room, the sudden silence of teenagers who think adults are slower on the uptake than they actually are. I'd noticed the pattern for at least 2 years before I finally understood what it meant. A certain look that passed between Sable and Dashiell whenever I mentioned work. A smirk quickly smoothed into something more neutral whenever I glanced their way. The specific quality of laughter that dies the moment its subject enters the room. I found out the actual phrase from my niece Sable's Instagram caption under a photo from Thanksgiving. Just a joke, LOL, tagged with a laughing emoji, referencing something I'd apparently said about my job at the community college's financial aid office. I only saw it because her account was still public back then, a detail she corrected within days of realizing I'd seen it, though by then the damage of understanding had already been done. The photo itself was innocuous enough, a candid shot of the dinner table, me mid-sentence in the background, clearly explaining something about my work to whoever had been sitting near me. The caption underneath, though, made it clear that whatever I'd said had become, at some point in that meal or in the years before it, a running bit among her friend group, Aunt Renata and her financial aid nonsense. One comment read, with 3 crying laughing emojis attached, from a friend of Sable's I'd never met. I sat with my phone for a long time after finding that, feeling something curdle slowly in my chest, the particular delayed sting of realizing you've been the butt of a joke for longer than you knew, that other people, strangers, even friends of a 17-year-old I'd never met, had been invited to laugh at a caricature of me that bore almost no resemblance to who I actually was or what I actually did. I'd worked at the community college for 9 years by that point, first as an advisor, and then for the last 5, running the financial aid office's outreach program specifically for first-generation students, kids who were often the first in their families to consider college at all, who arrived in my office overwhelmed by verification worksheets and dependency override forms and the Byzantine, often cruel logic of the FAFSA formula, having no one else in their lives who could translate any of it for them. I loved that work in a way I rarely tried to explain to people outside it, because explaining it well took more effort than most casual conversations allowed for, and because I'd learned over the years that most people's eyes glazed over somewhere around the word financial aid, hearing bureaucracy where I heard, instead, years of watching kids from difficult circumstances actually make it to graduation because someone had sat with them long enough to untangle a form that would have otherwise blocked their way entirely. It paid modestly. I want to be honest about that because the money was never the point of the job for me, but it was very much the point for how Ren's side of the family seemed to evaluate it. My salary, if anyone at those family gatherings had bothered to ask directly instead of implying, would have sounded unremarkable next to Trent's numbers. Trent, my brother-in-law, who'd built a real estate portfolio over the past decade that had, by his own frequent telling, made him a genuinely wealthy man. He wasn't shy about it. At every gathering, holidays especially, Trent held court about property values, about a duplex he'd flipped for triple what he'd paid, about market trends in 3 different states he was apparently now investing in, delivered in the confident, expansive tone of a man who assumed the whole table found this as fascinating as he did. Meanwhile, I got asked, at roughly every other gathering, whether I'd found a real job yet, usually from Trent himself, usually delivered with a grin that was meant to read as affectionate teasing but that had, over 9 years, worn a groove into me deep enough that I'd stopped being able to hear it as anything but genuine contempt wrapped in humor for plausible deniability. My sister Ren rarely corrected him on it, which stung in its own particular way, though I understood, or told myself I understood, that Ren had built her whole adult identity around Trent's success, that questioning his casual dismissiveness toward my career would have meant questioning something load-bearing in her own life that she wasn't prepared to examine. I'd absorbed those comments for years the way you absorb things from family, not without cost but without making a scene about it either, telling myself it didn't matter what Trent thought my job was worth, that I knew its actual value even if nobody at that table did. What I hadn't understood, until that Instagram caption, was how deep the joke had actually traveled. Not just Trent's casual dismissiveness at holiday dinners, but an entire running bit among Ren's own children, cultivated apparently over years, about the specific nature of my work. The punchline, when I finally understood its full shape, landed harder than I expected because it wasn't simply that Sable and Dashiell thought my job was unimpressive in some generic sense. It was more specific and more pointed than that. They'd been quietly mocking me for years over the exact expertise I actually possessed, joking, according to a screenshot a cousin eventually showed me, not entirely without her own discomfort at having witnessed it, that Aunt Renata plays with poor kids' paperwork all day, as though the entire career I'd built, the master's degree in higher education administration I'd earned taking night classes for 3 years while working full-time, the specialized knowledge of federal aid formulas and state grant programs and verification appeals that I'd spent nearly a decade accumulating amounted to nothing more than some kind of charitable hobby for people who couldn't manage anything more lucrative. I remember sitting on my couch that evening, phone in my lap, feeling the specific loneliness of understanding that you've been misunderstood by your own family for years without realizing the scope of it. I thought about all the students I'd helped over those 9 years. Kids who'd shown up in my office in tears because they thought a clerical error on a form meant they couldn't afford to keep attending. Kids who'd later sent me graduation announcements. One who'd mailed me an actual thank you card from his first job after finishing his engineering degree, crediting the fact that I'd caught a dependency status error that would have otherwise cost his family thousands of dollars they didn't have. None of that, apparently, had ever made its way into how Ren's kids saw me. To them, I was simply a punchline. A woman who played with poor kids' paperwork, a phrase specifically engineered, I understood now, to make my actual expertise sound both unserious and slightly pathetic in the same breath. I didn't say anything to Ren about it at the time. I told myself there was no clean way to bring it up without turning Thanksgiving into a battlefield, without forcing my sister to choose between defending me and defending the children she'd clearly, in some fashion, allowed to absorb Trent's dismissiveness as their own. So I filed it away, the way I'd filed away years of Trent's comments, and went back to my actual work on Monday morning, sitting across from an 18-year-old named Marisol who was crying quietly in my office because she thought a verification hold meant she'd lose her spot in the fall semester, and I spent 40 minutes walking her through exactly what documents she needed and exactly how to submit them. And she left my office relieved instead of terrified, and I told myself that mattered. More than anything, my niece and nephew thought they understood about the value of my work. 3 weeks ago, Ren called me in a panic. I almost didn't pick up. It was a Tuesday evening. I was halfway through making dinner, and some tired, self-protective part of me had gotten into the habit of letting her calls go to voicemail more often than I used to, a small quiet withdrawal I'd started allowing myself since the Instagram caption, though I'd never said anything to her directly about why. But something in the rhythm of the buzzing, 3 calls in under 2 minutes, told me this wasn't a casual check-in, so I answered. Dashiell got into Amherst, she said, before I'd even gotten a full hello out, and for a second I thought that was the whole call. Good news, a proud moment I was supposed to share in. I actually smiled, genuinely happy for him despite everything, because whatever his sister and he had said about me in private, he was still my nephew, still a kid I'd watched grow up, still someone I wanted to see succeed. That's incredible, I said. Ren, that's such a huge accomplishment. It was, she said, and something in the past tense of that sentence made my stomach tighten before she'd even gotten to the actual reason for the call. We celebrated for like 4 days. Trent took the whole family out. We told everyone it was. She stopped, and I heard her take a breath that didn't quite steady itself before the next part. The financial aid letter came yesterday. I already knew from the tone alone roughly what direction this was heading, but I let her say it because some things need to be said out loud by the person living through them rather than guessed at by the person listening. The number they're asking us to pay, Ren said, is almost the full cost. Almost $68,000 a year, Renata. We thought, Trent said with his income, sure, we wouldn't get much aid, but we thought we'd get something. Some kind of merit piece, at least something. And instead they calculated our expected contribution at basically the entire sticker price, and I don't. Her voice cracked slightly, an unfamiliar sound for my sister, who'd spent years cultivating a particular composed, unbothered surface for every hard thing in her life. I don't understand how that's possible. Trent doesn't even have that much liquid. Most of what he has is tied up in properties. And there it was, laid out plainly, The exact mechanism I could have predicted the moment she said the word properties, if she'd called me even a month earlier, before any of this had calcified into a crisis. Real estate holdings, especially the kind Trent had built his reputation on multiple properties, some held for cash flow, others flipped for quick profit, get treated very differently by financial aid formulas than most people assume. Home equity in a primary residence gets excluded from need calculations at most schools, but investment properties, rental income, capital gains from flips, business assets held under an LLC, all of that gets counted, often quite aggressively, in exactly the way that torpedoes a family's aid package regardless of how cash poor that same family might feel month to month. Trent's whole financial identity, the one he'd built and bragged about for a decade at every family gathering, had been engineered around exactly the kind of assets that read, to a financial aid formula, as enormous wealth that formula assumed could simply be liquidated or borrowed against to pay for college, whether or not that was remotely how Trent actually thought about his own money. "I know this is awkward," Wren said, and I could hear her searching for the right amount of humility to bring to this request, aware, on some level, of exactly how strange this moment was for both of us. "But you know this stuff. You do this for a living. Could you maybe look at his FAFSA before the deadline? I don't even know what half these terms mean, and the school's financial aid office keeps sending us these emails full of jargon, and Trent's been on the phone with his accountant for 2 days and getting nowhere, and she exhaled. I don't know who else to ask." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after that, not saying anything, thinking about the Instagram caption I'd never told her I'd seen, thinking about years of giggling that died the instant I entered her room, thinking about the phrase, "Aunt Renata plays with poor kids' paperwork all day," delivered by her own daughter to an audience of friends who'd never met me, about a career that required a master's degree and 9 years of accumulated, genuinely difficult expertise now being requested of me, in a moment of crisis, as a casual favor. The uncharitable part of me, and I want to be honest that this part existed loudly in that first silent stretch on the phone, wanted to say something sharp. Wanted to ask her whether Dashiell and Sable still thought my job was a joke, now that the actual mechanics of it stood between their family and $68,000 a year. Wanted to make her sit, even briefly, in the particular discomfort of having mocked something for years and then needing it, urgently, the moment it became inconvenient not to have it. But I didn't say any of that, not yet. Not in that first phone call, because underneath the sting of the Instagram caption and years of Trent's comments, there was still a genuine kid in the middle of this. Dashiell, 17 years old, who as far as I knew hadn't personally originated any of the mockery, who might have simply absorbed his sister's joke the way younger siblings absorb things, without necessarily meaning any of it the way it had landed on me. And there was still my sister, however imperfect her silence over the years had been, asking me for help in a voice stripped of its usual polish, genuinely frightened about her son's future. "Send me the FAFSA and the aid letter," I said finally. "And send me Trent's asset breakdown if he can pull that together. Everything, the properties, how they're held, whether anything's under an LLC or a trust. I can't promise there's a fix, Wren. Sometimes there isn't one. But I'll actually look at it properly before I tell you that." "Thank you," she said, and the relief in her voice was immediate and enormous, enough that some old, worn groove in me softened slightly despite everything. "Renata, thank you so much. I know things have been. I know we haven't always." She stopped there, not quite finding her way to whatever admission she was circling, and I let her stop because I wasn't ready in that moment to have the fuller conversation underneath this one. "Send me the documents," I said again. "Let's just start there." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before opening my laptop, turning the whole situation over in my mind. Some part of me recognized the strange, almost absurd symmetry of it, that the exact expertise reduced to a punchline at family dinners for years was now the only thing standing between my nephew and a financial aid disaster his own father's bragged about wealth had directly caused. I thought about Marisol and the dozens of students like her I'd helped over the years, kids with far less margin for error than Dashiell had, kids whose families had never had the luxury of investment properties to begin with, and I thought about how strange it was that this specific skill, developed in service of exactly those kids, was now being asked of me on behalf of the same family that had spent years treating my work with barely concealed contempt. I opened my laptop anyway. Whatever I decided to say to Ren or to her children about any of this, I wasn't going to let Dashiell's future become collateral damage in a reckoning I hadn't even decided yet how to have. The documents came through that night. A PDF of the FAFSA, a scan of the aid letter with Trent's handwriting in the margins where he'd apparently tried to do his own math and abandoned it halfway down the page, and a spreadsheet from Trent's accountant listing out 6 properties, 3 held under an LLC, 2 under a different LLC. One still in Trent's own name because it had been his childhood home before he inherited and converted it to a rental. I spent 2 hours that first night just reading, the way I always did with a new case, letting the actual shape of the problem emerge before I let myself think about solutions. The picture that formed was almost exactly what I'd suspected on the phone. The FAFSA, at the federal level, had captured Trent's business and investment assets in a way that inflated their expected family contribution dramatically. Non-retirement investment real estate counted nearly dollar for dollar against aid eligibility, and Trent had a lot of it, spread across those 2 LLCs in a structure that, from what I could tell, had been built entirely around tax efficiency and liability protection with zero thought given to how it would eventually read on a financial aid form, because why would anyone think about that a decade before their kid applied to college? Amherst, like most schools with this level of selectivity, also used the CSS profile, which dug even deeper than the FAFSA into home equity and business net worth, closing off some of the looser interpretations that a FAFSA-only school might have allowed. I called Ren back 2 days later, once I'd actually mapped out where the real problems were and where there might be genuine room to work. There's no version of this where you get significant need-based aid, I told her honestly, because I'd learned years ago that false hope in this work does more damage than a hard truth delivered early. Not with the assets structured the way they currently are. But there are a few things worth trying before the appeal deadline. I walked her through it, patiently, the way I would with any student sitting across from me in my actual office. Amherst, like many schools, had a professional judgment appeal process, a mechanism for financial aid officers to reconsider a family's calculated contribution when there were circumstances the standard formula didn't capture well. It wasn't a magic fix, and I told her that clearly, but if Trent's properties were generating far less actual cash flow than their paper value suggested, which, going through the numbers, several of them clearly were tied up in renovation debt and thin margins that made them look far wealthier on paper than they behaved in reality, there was a legitimate case to be made that the formula had overstated their genuine capacity to pay. I spent the better part of a week helping Ren and Trent assemble that appeal, something I would never have had the time to do for a stranger walking into my office at this level of detail, but which I did for my nephew's sake with the same rigor I brought to Marisol's case, or any of the dozens of students I'd genuinely fought for over the years. I helped them document the actual net cash flow from each property, not just its assessed value. I helped them write a professional judgment letter that explained, clearly and without excessive editorializing, the gap between Trent's paper wealth and his liquid reality. I flagged, gently, that one of the properties held under the LLC actually qualified for a specific exclusion most families never knew to ask about, since it functioned as Trent's actual place of business rather than a pure investment, something buried in language most non-specialists would have scrolled straight past. Trent, to his credit, showed up differently through this process than I'd expected. He called me directly, 3 days into the appeal work, something he'd never done in 9 years of family gatherings. "I've been an idiot about this," he said, without much preamble, in a tone I didn't recognize from him, none of the confident real estate patter he usually brought to any conversation. "I built this whole portfolio thinking it made us secure, and it turns out it's actively hurting my own kids' chances, and I didn't understand a single word of that aid letter until you explained it. I owe you an apology, and not just for the aid letter." I let that sit for a second before answering. "What do you mean, not just for the aid letter?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ren told me about the Instagram thing. The caption, from Sable. I didn't know about it before, but she told me this week when I asked her why you seemed distant, I guess, on the phone." Another pause. "I've made comments over the years. The real job thing. I thought I was being funny. I didn't think about what it actually taught my kids to think about what you do." It wasn't a complete reckoning, I noticed, even then, that he framed it mostly around what his comments had taught his kids, rather than fully sitting in what those comments had cost me directly, year after year, at table after table. But it was more honesty than I'd gotten from him in 9 years combined, and I decided, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, that I could work with more honesty than I'd gotten before, even if it wasn't yet everything. Your kids didn't invent that joke out of nowhere, I said. I appreciate you saying this. But if you actually want it to matter, it can't just be an apology to me. Sable and Dashiell need to hear directly that what I do isn't a punchline. Not because I need them to grovel about it, but because there's a kid in my office every single week who needs someone to take this work seriously, and if your own children think it's a joke, that attitude doesn't stay contained to our family. It teaches them something about who deserves respect and who doesn't. The appeal went in 2 days before the deadline. I don't know, even now, exactly how much of what happened next was the appeal itself and how much was simple luck, but 3 weeks later Amherst's financial aid office came back with a revised offer. Not the full need-based package Wren had originally hoped for, but a meaningful adjustment, enough to close roughly 40% of the original gap. Along with a merit scholarship Dashiell qualified for that nobody in the family had bothered to look into applying for separately, buried in a section of the school's website that required actual patience to find. It wasn't a complete fix. Trent and Wren would still be taking out loans, still restructuring some of those properties in ways Trent's accountant was clearly unhappy about, still facing a genuinely difficult 4 years of payments. But it was workable in a way the original letter hadn't been, and Dashiell was going to Amherst in the fall without his family collapsing under the weight of it. Sable found me at the small family dinner Wren threw a week later, once the appeal had come back and some of the crisis energy had drained out of the house. She caught me in the kitchen while I was helping clear plates, and she stood there for a moment before speaking, in the particular awkward posture of a teenager working up to something she'd rather not say. My mom told me you saw the Instagram thing, she said finally. I did, I said, not making it easier for her. Not filling the silence the way I might have a year earlier, before I'd fully understood how deep that particular joke had traveled. I'm sorry, she said, and to her credit, she didn't make it about herself, didn't rush past it towards some faster resolution. I didn't really think about what it actually meant, what you actually do. I just thought it was funny because Dad always made it sound like. She stopped herself, visibly deciding not to finish that particular sentence, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. It wasn't funny. Not really. Especially not now, knowing you're the actual reason Dashiell's going where he wanted to go in the fall. I don't need you to feel guilty forever, I told her, and I meant it. But I do need you to actually understand what the work is if you're going to talk about it at all. It's not paperwork for poor kids as some kind of charity project. It's the difference between a first-generation student finishing college or dropping out because a form got filled out wrong. It's real expertise, and it matters, and it deserves to be talked about like it matters, even at a dinner table where nobody thinks anyone's listening. She nodded, and something in her face told me she actually heard that, not just the words but the years of accumulated sting underneath them. I'm going to take down the post, she said. I already meant to after Mom told me, but I wanted to actually apologize first instead of just quietly deleting it and hoping you would notice. Thank you, I said, and I found, standing there in Wren's kitchen with a stack of plates in my hands, that I meant that too, more fully than I expected to. I don't know if the joke disappeared entirely from that family's private vocabulary, or if some quieter version of it still exists somewhere, the way old family patterns tend to linger long after anyone's officially apologized for them. But something did shift that fall. Trent started asking me, unprompted, actual questions about my work at gatherings, questions with real curiosity in them instead of performance. Dashiell sent me a message in September, once he'd started classes, thanking me properly, in his own words, for what I'd done, adding that he'd started telling his roommate about financial aid formulas like he actually understood them now because I'd taken the time to make sure he did. And when Wren asked me, cautiously, a few months later, whether I'd be willing to talk to a friend of hers whose daughter was struggling with her own aid appeal, I said yes without hesitation, not because the family owed me anything, and not because I needed anyone's redemption arc to feel complete, but because that had always been the actual point of the work in the first place, long before anyone in my family had bothered to understand what it was worth.